of the sampling video lecture. Welcome to Chartered Accountants Academy, and please make sure that you've watched part 1 before you watch this part 2. Our objectives in part 2 are to discuss the types of audit sampling methods, secondly, to outline statistical sampling techniques, and lastly, to discuss attributes sampling applied to test of controls. So let's jump in. So once you've selected a sample size, once you've determined the sample size, you need to go on to then select the items within the sample that are going to be used for testing, for your auditing procedures. So you could then, when you've got your sample, you can randomly select the items that you're going to be testing, or you can systematically select, which is maybe selecting every second or every third item within the sample, or you can also do it in a haphazard manner where you're just going haphazard in your selection of the items within the population. We've got statistical sampling techniques that are there, about 4 of them. But within the 4 that we're going to just look at, or that you're seeing on your slide, only 2 of them are relevant for your CTA, and only 2 of them are going to be tested, which is your attribute sampling and your monetary unit sampling techniques. Your discovery sampling is not tested, as well as your classical variable sampling. That is also not going to be tested. What is attribute sampling? So your attribute sampling means that every item that is being sampled will or will not possess a certain quality or a certain characteristic, which is an attribute. And when using attribute sampling, the sampling unit is maybe a single record or a document. So that is to say that in attribute sampling, if the quality that you're looking for or the attribute that you're looking for is maybe a signature within an invoice, that is the attribute, or pre-numbering, that is the attribute that you're going to be testing for. So with regards to your attribute sampling, when they're being applied on test of controls, the auditor needs to make sure that they have adequately planned, performed, and evaluated the sampling application, and they need to adequately document each of the phases of the sampling application. So let's look at planning. So in terms of planning, we've got 3 major stages that we need to do when we're planning for attribute sampling. First and foremost, as part of the plan, you need to determine your test objectives. What is it that you want to achieve? Secondly, you define the population characteristics, and we'll look at that further. And then you then have to determine the sample size using certain inputs, which we'll also discuss later. So in terms of determining your objectives, which is first stage of planning. So the objective of attribute sampling when used in test of controls is to evaluate the operating effectiveness of a control. And your control could be pre-numbering, or your control could be a signature on an invoice. That is the control that you want to determine whether it is operating effectively or it's not operating effectively. Once you've determined your objective, you then need to go and define the population characteristics. And in defining the population characteristics, you need to do 3 things. Firstly, you define the sampling population. Is your sampling population data, or what exactly is your sampling population? You define the sampling unit. Is it an invoice within the data? And lastly, you define the control deviation conditions. So let's go back. All of the items that constitute a class of transaction or an account balance make up the sampling population. So it's each and every data or each and every sales receipt and sales invoice. That is what makes the entire sampling population. Then when we've defined the sampling population to say all debtors, we then go and say each sampling unit makes up an item in the population. So we've got all our debtors as the population, but the sampling unit is a debtor's invoice, for example. So the sampling unit should be defined in relation to the specific control that is being tested. So the sampling unit, if it's a debtor's invoice, that is what we're saying is our sampling unit. So we need to then define it in relation to the control, because what control are we looking for on the sampling unit? Is it, as I said, pre-numbering, or is it a signature? So once you've defined the sampling unit to say it's every invoice, so it's the invoices that we're going to be using, we then have to then define the deviation. And a deviation is a departure from adequate performance or an expectation that the control is working effectively. So it's a departure from our expectation. If our expectation is that there's a signature as a control, not having a signature is a departure from the expectation. So that's a deviation. So we then define that. Let's say it's pre-numbering, for example. A deviation from that could be lack of numbering, where we're expecting to have a pre-numbered invoice, but it's not numbered. That's a deviation. Or a deviation could be duplication of numbering, or it could be a skip in the sequence. So can you see, in giving you those examples, that would have been maybe our definition of a deviation from our expectation. So that is, those are the three stages of the population, of defining the population. And then now when we've defined our population, we need to define our population size. We've defined our objective, we've defined our population. Now we have to then determine our population size. And our population size is determined using three inputs. And those are the desired confidence level, which we discussed in part 1, or the risk of incorrect acceptance, which we also discussed in part 1. Secondly, the tolerable deviation rate that will assist us in coming up with our population size. And lastly, the expected population deviation. Those are the three things that we need to decide or define as we're coming up with the size of the population. So we'll first look at the confidence level. And as I said earlier, we defined this in part 1. And we defined our confidence level as the desired level of assurance that the results from the test of control will support a conclusion that the control is functioning effectively. So we could have a desired level if the auditor could then set their desired level at a high level if they're going to then conclude that the controls are working effectively. So what's a high level? A high level could be 95% confidence level. That is what the auditor is saying. I can accept I have a 95% confidence level. That is to say maybe 5% of the controls are not working effectively. But the auditor will still conclude that the controls as a whole are working effectively. So that is a 95% confidence level. Then, after we've defined the confidence level, we then go on to the tolerable deviation rate. And remember from part 1, we defined the tolerable deviation rate as the maximum rate of deviation that the auditor is willing to accept before, or they're willing to accept that level and still say the controls are working effectively and still consider the control to be working effectively. So if you look at your slide, we've got a smaller table there, and our smaller table is is probably further explaining the concept that I'm trying to explain to you. So if we assess the control to be of importance, remember we've got different controls, and some controls might be assessed to be of more importance than others. So if we assess that this control is highly important, then it means that our tolerable deviation rate has to be lower. It means that our tolerable deviation is then maybe going to be 3 to 5%. That is maybe because our confidence level again is high. Because maybe we set our confidence level at 95%. So our tolerable deviation rate is 5%. If we set it at 97%, then our tolerable deviation rate is just 3%. But where we've concluded or assessed the control to be moderately important, then our tolerable deviation rate is going to go higher. So it means that we could have a tolerable deviation rate of 6 to 10%. That is to say that if the control is assessed to be moderately important, we can accept that 6 to 10% of our tests are going to be showing that the control is not working effectively. However, regardless of that 6 to 10%, the auditor will still conclude that the controls are working effectively. Then we've got, lastly, the expected population deviation rate. So the expected population deviation rate, that is derived mainly from the auditor's experience, to say that what is the expected rate that the auditor is willing to, or is expecting to deviate from the expected. So you find that the larger the expected deviation rate, the larger the sample size will have to be. So we've got a small example on our slide, which then says, assume that a desired confidence level of 90% is set, and a large population, The effect of the expected population deviation is on our smaller table in the green. So when we expect a population deviation of 1%, it means that our sample size can be lower. Where we expect a higher deviation, from the auditor's experience, they're expecting that, you know what, from this entire population, maybe 1.5% is going to show me that the controls are not working effectively. Then they will need to increase their sample size. As you can see from the table, the higher the expected deviation, the higher the sample size. However, you can get to a point whereby the sample size is too large to be cost effective. Where, yes, you might be expecting that 3%, there's a 3% expectation that the controls in the entire population are not working effectively. But however, you cannot then test the full sample, because yes, you're concluding that testing the full sample based on the 3% expectation of population deviation, it would be ineffective to test the controls. It would be ineffective to test that population, or that sample size from the population. So therefore, the auditor will then maybe say, I will test less items. They will not then test the entire sample size that's coming from the 3% expected deviation. And then lastly, we're going to look at what is the relationship between population size and in terms of attribute sampling. So you find that in general, when you're using attribute sampling, when you're going to be looking for particular attributes within your sampling units, you're saying that the population size is not an important factor in determining the sample size. So you're saying that the population size has no or little effect unless if the population is small. And a small population is defined as 500 and less items. That is when the population size will have an effect on the population, on the sample size. So let's just go back and revisit what we're discussing earlier and the effect of those items on the size of the sample. we talked about the desired confidence level, and we're saying the desired confidence level has a direct effect on your sample size. When you're saying that your desired confidence level is high, that is to say that your assurance, your level of assurance is high. It means that the sample sizes that you're going to select are going to be high as well. But when it comes to the tolerable deviation rate, if you're saying that this one has an inverse relationship, if you're saying that you want a lower deviation rate, you're only accepting that maybe 2 to 3%, that is what you're willing to accept, that is the maximum level that you're willing to accept, then it means that you need an increased sample size. And the opposite is true for a high deviation rate, a high tolerable deviation rate. And then we've got our expected population deviation rate. This is a direct relationship, as we saw in the last slide that I just explained to you. As well as the population size, its effect is as explained in earlier in this slide. So next steps, please make sure that you watch parts 3 and 4 of sampling video lecture. We've watched 1 and 2. Please make sure that to completely know your sampling, you've watched 3 and 4. Thank you very much.